What if the deadliest threat to a World War II pilot wasn't enemy fire, but the very ship he was trying to land on? It's May 1945. You're a U.S. Navy pilot aboard the USS Enterprise, lining up your approach while the fuel gauge trembles toward empty. Below, the flight deck is a moving island of steel, lights, and men and fuel. You radio for permission. The answer is the same every time. Denied. The deck is full. You're forced to circle low, watching the needle drop. Every breath a countdown. Enemy bullets are terrifying. But today, the real danger is your own carrier, crowded, fragile, and inching you toward a simple, deadly math. Below him, the flight deck is a chaotic steel island crammed with fighters, fueled and armed, crews racing like ants under a storm. He's denied landing, the deck is full, and radio voices come back in clipped refusals. Forced to circle, he watches the fuel needle crawl toward empty with every pass. Each lap tightens the noose. Nowhere safe to touch down, no quick rescue if anything goes wrong. The very fleet meant to save him has become the hazard that might kill him. This was the fatal paradox of the World War II aircraft carrier. The single most powerful tool at sea was also its own Achilles heel. These floating airfields could strike across oceans, but their flight decks were a bottleneck. One narrow runway, where dozens of fast, armed planes had to recover, be refueled, rearmed, and moved by hand. A snapped wire, a single crash, and the whole machine ground to a halt, leaving pilots circling with dwindling fuel and nowhere safe to land. It's a brutal irony. Unmatched offensive reach, paired with a tiny, lethal vulnerability built right into the ship's design, starting with how planes actually landed. On a straight-deck carrier, landing was a painfully slow process. Each plane needed about 90 seconds to hit the arresting wires, snag the hook, and be wrestled off the landing area by deckhands and tugs. 90 seconds isn't much until a dozen planes are circling with dwindling fuel. The deck became a single-file bottleneck, and every successful catch just stretched the waiting doom for those still in the air. For a returning squadron, it meant a long, terrifying wait circling above like hunted birds while the carrier shuffled planes inch by inch below. Every approach ate time and fuel. One snapped arresting wire, one bad landing, and the deck could erupt into a blazing maze of twisted metal and burning fuel, instantly turning the carrier from lifeline to death trap. Fire crews and deck crews would be helpless as operations ground to a halt. Catapults frozen, launches stopped, launches that might have saved those still airborne. Pilots low on gas watched their options shrink by the second, praying the deck stayed safe long enough to take them home. But bringing the planes aboard didn't end the danger, it created a new one. The deck became a packed parking lot, fighters nose to tail, torpedoes and bombs strapped on, fuel tanks steaming in the sun. There was no clear runway anymore, just a forest of wings and propellers, metal and explosives jammed so tight a single mishap could chain react into a blazing trap. Sailors moved like careful surgeons, threading between aircraft with hoses and wrenches, every step measured against catastrophe. For a carrier, being full meant being useless, unable to launch, vulnerable, and at the mercy of time and human hands. For the next 60 to 90 minutes, deck crews became human chess pieces, painstakingly shoving multi-ton fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes into tiny slotted spaces so other aircraft could line up and launch tractors grunting, men in greasy overalls hauling ropes, crews signaling with clipped arms, smoke and jet exhaust stinging the eyes. Every move was deliberate and slow because one bumped wing, one dropped chalk, one spark from a fuel line could stop everything. It was a brutal, precise game of Tetris, played on steel at sea, where seconds meant the difference between a successful strike and a stranded pilot circling with an empty tank. Admiral Mark Mitcher grimly named it the deck cycle problem. In plain terms, one hit, one snapped wire, one cockpit full fire, and the carrier, no matter how mighty, could be turned into a dead ship. Planes became obstacles, arresting gear jammed. The deck turned into a burning parking lot where no aircraft could land or launch. Commanders could not bring the ship back into the fight until crews had painstakingly cleared and reorganized every armed, fueled aircraft. It was a flaw of geometry and timing that made the carrier momentarily helpless, a vulnerability that would soon have brutal, real-world consequences. It wasn't a theory. It was a decision made in the heat of battle. On the 7th of December 1941, Admiral Nagumo's carriers were forced to call off a final, crushing blow. Their flight decks were clogged after recovering the second-wave planes piled nose to tail, fueled, armed, and immovable. With the landing area a flaming jam of aircraft and crew, there was no way to quickly rearm and launch a third strike. The fleet steamed away, its chance to finish the job lost to geometry and timing. That missed opportunity would echo through naval thinking, and 6 months later, the same flaw would help doom Japanese carriers at Midway. 6 months later at Midway, that flaw didn't just slow things down, it destroyed ships. Japanese carriers, caught mid-deck cycle with fully fueled, armed planes packed like kindling across their decks, became sitting targets. Bombs and torpedoes punched through flight decks. Fuel-fed fires ran unchecked from hangar to sea. In minutes, 3 carriers, 3 floating airfields were gutted, their air groups erased, their decks a chaos of flame and wreckage. What had been a logistical headache turned into a tactical death sentence. If you couldn't launch, recover, and relaunch faster, you would be caught utterly helpless. The brutal lesson was clear. Carrier combat had stopped being a war of attrition and become a quick-draw contest. A single moment of indecision, one broken wire, one clogged deck, could turn a carrier from hunter to sitting duck. As Commander Wade McCluskey put it, victory went to the side that could launch, recover, and relaunch faster than the enemy. Everyone else was simply trapped, circling with dwindling fuel, praying the deck would be ready. Speed, rhythm, and the ability to absorb a mistake became the new currency of survival, forcing navies to rethink not just tactics, but the very geometry of the ship. The Navy's stopgap was simple and savage: brute force. Instead of solving the traffic jam, they threw more steel at it. 3 carriers doing the work of one. One would stand up the strike, one would recover the returning flight, and a third would handle rearming and refueling, a rotating carousel that kept planes moving but ate time, fuel, and ships. It worked in theory. In practice, it meant more hulls to build, more crews to feed, and a fragile choreography that collapsed if a single carrier was damaged or delayed. It was costly, clumsy, and ultimately unsustainable a bandage, not a cure, and the problem only grew worse. The problem only worsened. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, it took 97 agonizing minutes to recover 226 aircraft. Pilots circled, fuel needles slipping into the red. Engines died. Planes plunged into the sea before they could be caught. The loss was so stark, it picked up a grim nickname, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. And the irony was cruel. Both enemy and American planes sank in that same blue. The Navy's 3-carrier workaround was proving blunt and wasteful. This wasn't just bad luck. It was a structural crisis that forced commanders to look for a radically different fix. But across the Atlantic, an unlikely solution was taking root. The Royal Navy didn't have the luxury of triple carrier formations or calm Pacific weather. Their carriers were smaller, their decks cramped, and the North Atlantic was a brutal teacher, rolling seas, howling winds, and no room for error. That pressure forced a different kind of thinking, improvisation, cunning, and small, practical experiments born of necessity rather than doctrine. Sailors and pilots began to ask simpler questions. How do we recover planes when there's nowhere to park them? And to try answers that looked odd on paper but made perfect sense on a pitching, salt-lashed deck. The cramped decks and violent seas of their operating environment turned every landing into a gamble. These British carriers were smaller, their flight decks a few fragile dozen yards, pitching and rolling under relentless Atlantic weather while planes waited, engines hot, or slammed down by a single gust. There wasn't room for the slow, orderly poker of straight-deck recovery. Storms shredded timing. Seas made parked aircraft dangerous. And every extra minute in the air risked fuel, lives, and ships. Necessity sharpened minds. Deck crews, pilots, and engineers began to treat the carrier as a puzzle to be rearranged, not just a runway to be obeyed. In 1943, aboard HMS Illustrious, Captain Matthew Slattery started testing something that looked almost reckless. Landings on a narrow offset lane cut into the crowded deck. Pilots threaded a tight corridor between parked armed aircraft. Deck crews held their breath. It worked. Planes could be brought aboard without clearing the entire flight deck, turning what felt like a logjam into a manageable flow. It was a small, stubborn experiment, born of necessity, a British fix that quietly proved the problem could be solved and caught the attention of outsiders watching for answers. This small success jumped off the deck and landed in the lap of Dennis Campbell, a civilian physicist who didn't think like a sailor, he thought like an engineer. To him, the carrier wasn't a runway, it was a logistics puzzle, a buzzing railway junction where aircraft were rolling stock, wires and crews, the switches and sidings. He began to map traffic flows in his head, where the bottlenecks were, how a missed hook could cascade into disaster, how a tiny change in geometry might rewrite the whole timetable. That shift in thinking from pilot's approach to system throughput set the stage for a far bolder sketch. In January 1944, civilian physicist Dennis Campbell did something audacious. He stopped treating the carrier deck like a runway and started seeing it as geometry, a busy junction of moving parts. He put pencil to paper and asked a deceptively simple question. What if, instead of just painting an offset line, you angled the whole rear section by 5 degrees? 5 degrees. Tiny. Radical. That small tilt, on paper, suddenly split the deck into 2 usable lanes, land on the angled strip. While other planes could be rolled and launched from the forward deck, a neat, almost surgical fix to a problem that had been killing pilots and crippling fleets. The sketch was deceptively simple. A slanted landing lane drawn across the carrier's stern that turned one clogged runway into 2 working ones. Imagine jets coming in at an angle while others roared off the bow, landing and launching happening at the same time. No more planes parked in the landing path, no single choke point where one wreck could stop the whole air group. It wasn't a new engine or exotic gadget, just a change of geometry that promised to untangle the flight deck like rerouting traffic through an overpass. Elegant, almost cheeky, too simple, some would later argue, but brutally effective on paper. The Admiralty was skeptical. Rebuild a warship based on a physicist's sketch? No, too radical. So they did the cautious thing, approve a low-risk trial. No dry dock surgery, no hull alterations, just painted angled landing lines on HMS Triumph, shifted arresting wires, and watched. It was small, almost humble. But small experiments have a way of becoming revolutions. In August 1944, aboard HMS Triumph, test pilot Eric Brown climbed in, eyed the freshly painted offset landing line, and found it disorienting. The slanted deck forced a new kind of approach, a different rhythm, a recalibration of instinct. He landed anyway. He proved you could recover aircraft on the angle, while others launched simultaneous launch and recovery, real and repeatable. But it wasn't a cure-all. The shallow sweep eased the traffic jam but left the single deadliest failure untouched. Missed the wires, and a plane could still plow into parked, fueled aircraft. The trial worked, but only partially. The painted angle eased the traffic jam, yes, but it didn't remove the carrier's single most terrifying fault: a pilot who simply missed the wires. What happens then? On a straight deck, a missed arrest wasn't a near miss. It was a death sentence, an aircraft careening into a tightly packed, fueled, armed parking lot of planes, sparking a chain reaction of fire, explosions, and broken deck machinery that could stop flight operations cold. Pilots, circling low with dwindling fuel, became sitting ducks. One bungled landing could turn an entire carrier into a blazing wreck and strand every plane in the air. The war ended, and with it the urgency that had forced wild, inventive fixes. The painted angle trials, clever, improvised, and only partially solved, were boxed up. Drawings went to dusty cabinets, test reports yellowed on a shelf, and the deadly, familiar, straight deck stayed the rule. In peacetime, caution and limited budgets beat curiosity. A useful British idea became an archival footnote instead of doctrine. It was an odd kind of defeat, not from an enemy, but from complacency and bureaucratic momentum. For a time, the carriers simply kept doing what they'd always done, and the moment to change quietly slipped away. By 1951, the jet age had landed on carriers, and it changed everything. These new airplanes were heavier, faster, and less forgiving than the prop planes they'd been designed around. Approach speeds climbed, stopping distances lengthened, and the old straight-deck dance of catch and tow suddenly risked turning a missed wire into a flaming pileup. Deck crews who once shuffled planes like puzzle pieces now faced machines with far more kinetic energy and far less patience. Sorties slowed, accidents rose, and the carrier's once brilliant cyclical choreography became a logistical and safety nightmare. The problem was no longer theoretical. It was urgent. Someone had to find a way to make carriers work for jets quickly. Then came Commander Walter Boone, a test pilot who'd watched jets get dismissed as too hot, too heavy, too dangerous, and was tired of polite skepticism. He was given the job nobody wanted: find a way to make jets live on carriers. So he crawled into the Navy's archives, through yellowing reports and forgotten diagrams, pushing aside dust and assumption until he found a brittle British file about an odd idea, a painted line, an angled landing path. It was a small, almost embarrassing discovery on paper, but Boone felt it differently. He didn't just see a traffic trick. He saw a way out. Boone looked at those faded sketches and stopped seeing a clever way to clear a deck. He saw a lifeline. To him, the angle wasn't just a clever traffic hack, it was the difference between a pilot bouncing back into the sky and a pilot slamming into a parked, fueled fighter. Jets were heavier, faster, and far less forgiving than the old prop planes. Miss the wires, and you didn't just waste an aircraft, you turned the ship into a crucible. Boone realized that by increasing that little tilt, a missed arrestment could become a routine go-around survival engineered into geometry. Boone saw it in a flash. The angle wasn't just a traffic fix. Bump it to 8, maybe 10 degrees, and a missed wire stops being a death sentence. Instead of slamming into a parking lot of fueled, armed planes, A pilot would have a clean, clear runway ahead to shove the throttle forward and climb back into the sky. That moment turned catastrophe into option. It turned a one-way gamble into a recoverable mistake. They even had a word for it, a bolter, and for the first time, landing mishap felt like something you could survive rather than something that would kill you. What had been a single, terrifying point of failure, missed the wires, and you smashed into fueled, parked planes, suddenly became something routine, a controlled touch and go. Miss the wires, jam the throttle, and you were back in the sky, not exploding on the deck. That small change flipped the equation. Risk turned into recoverable error. Pilots regained confidence. Commanders could sustain operations instead of praying the deck stayed clear. It wasn't just a trick of traffic management anymore. It was a survival hack that multiplied a carrier's combat power. But an idea on paper is only the start. Someone still had to sell it to the Navy. In March 1951, Boone walked into Rear Admiral Apollo Susk's office with a sketch, a stubborn idea, and the sort of quiet confidence you only get from staring at a problem until it gives up. Susk, the old guard in uniform, square-jawed, arms folded, the kind of man who trusted shipyards over sketches, listened without a flicker, and when Boone finished laying out how an angled deck could turn a catastrophic miss into a routine bolter, the Admiral's reply was blunt and final. "A painted line isn't going to change physics, Commander. Prove it." The challenge landed like a thrown glove, permission to try, but everything at stake. The challenge was set. Boone's team got the USS Midway. No expensive retrofit, no months in dry dock. Instead, they painted an 8-degree landing lane across the aft deck, shifted arresting wires and gear, and changed the landing geometry with nothing more than paint and manpower. It was a bold, surgical experiment, low risk on paper, and enough to prove a point. In an instant, the Midway became 2 runways on one ship, a clear forward lane to catapult planes into the sky, and a second angled touchdown strip to catch returning jets. What had been a single, dangerous funnel of traffic was split into separate arteries, launch and recovery, happening at once, and with that small, brutal change, the stage was set for a naval aviation revolution. The first test came in July 1951, and it didn't just validate a theory, it blew minds. What had taken 90 grinding minutes to recover a dozen planes and launch a dozen more was ripped down to 18. Pilots who once watched fuel gauges bleed out now found decks ready in a fraction of the time. Deck crews moved from frantic Tetris to controlled choreography. Sortie rates leapt. Losses from missed wires plummeted, and the carrier's combat tempo transformed overnight. In a single afternoon, the Midway proved the angled deck could turn paralysis into momentum. Still, the real proof remained. Could a man deliberately miss the wires and walk away? The true test was still ahead. On the 7th approach, Commander Walter Boone climbed into the cockpit himself, hands steady on the throttle, eyes on a painted line that could change naval aviation forever. All the trials and numbers came down to this one run. Months of skepticism, Rear Admiral Susk's challenge, prove it, the painted angle on Midway. The frantic math of sortie rates, all of it narrowed to one moment and one man. Deck crews held their breath. The fleet watched. If he failed, the old problems would still be lethal. If he succeeded, carriers would never be the same. Could he prove the bolter? Commander Boone pushed his jet over the carrier like a man daring the sea to blink. He held the nose a hair high, trimmed for an intentional overshoot, and lined up with the painted angle so precisely every gauge whispered too high. The deck surged up beneath him, steel, men, armed aircraft, an avalanche waiting. For a heartbeat there was nothing but thin sky and awful arithmetic. Miss the wires here and you hit a furnace. It was a test of physics and of nerve. For a heartbeat, he hung over the deck too high, the wires gone, and the parked aircraft a looming wall. He slammed the throttle forward. The jet screamed, exhaust spitting, air howling past the cockpit as speed built in a furious rush. Down the clear, angled lane it thundered, passed above the parked fighters, and then, with a steady climb, punched back into the blue. He had performed a deliberate bolter. For a heartbeat, the deck seemed to hold its breath. Then the jet screamed, spat black smoke, and instead of becoming a mangled pile of metal and fire, it powered cleanly down the angled lane and climbed away. In that single, perfectly controlled failure, a terrifying inevitability was undone. Missing the wires no longer meant collision with parked armed aircraft and certain carnage. What had been the carrier's single deadliest point of failure became a routine recovery option touch: miss, power up, and go. It was a small maneuver with outsized consequence, the proof the Navy needed. The Navy was convinced. The order went out to retrofit the fleet, and what started as a clever test suddenly became an industrial sprint. Shipyards filled overnight with crews of welders, engineers, and sailors hauling blueprints like gospel. This wasn't a paint job or a tweak you could do between patrols. It demanded cutting into the ship's bones, reworking internal systems, and reshaping decks and islands to meet a new geometry. Months in dry dock, millions in labor, and 1,000 tiny technical decisions later, the carrier ceased to be the same machine it had been. It was being remade for a faster, safer age of naval air power. It wasn't a paint job. Angling the deck meant literally cutting into the ship, extending the flight deck out over the side of the hull, shifting the island farther to starboard, and gutting and rebuilding almost half of the arresting machinery below decks. Winches and cables were rerouted, hydraulic mounts moved, support beams reinforced. Men worked like surgeons, torches, jacks, and hours of welding. The carrier had to come apart to be put back together. It was messy, it was expensive, and it was the only way to turn a straight-deck relic into a vessel built for the jet age. The Herculean task required months in dry dock, but it also provided an opportunity to integrate other crucial jet-age innovations. Entire sections of deck were cut away. The island was shifted. Arresting gear, elevators, and wiring were ripped out and rebuilt from the keel up. It was messy, loud, dangerous workmen welding around the clock, plans rewritten as engineers learned what jets really demanded, but it was also a shop window for invention. With the flight deck stripped back to its bones, crews could bolt in new systems designed for heavier, faster aircraft, remaking the carrier into something far more capable. While the decks were ripped open in dry dock, engineers slid in a game-changer, the British steam catapult. A thunderous piston under the deck, it spat steam, grabbed a jet, and hurled it into the sky, giving life to planes too heavy for the old hydraulic launches. Suddenly those new jets had a runway where none seemed possible, and other deck technologies soon followed to finish the transformation. At the same time they bolted in steam catapults, they fitted something less noisy, but just as revolutionary. The British Mirror Landing System. Think of it as a pilot's visual autopilot, a mirrored optical meatball that gives a clear, real-time glide slope cue so a pilot can judge height and angle at a glance. On an angled deck, where approaches were counterintuitively tricky and margins were thin, that single visual reference turned guesswork into precision. No more wrestling with perspective on a pitching deck. Pilots could fly the approach with confidence, correct early, and when combined with the angled deck and catapult, actually transform carrier air operations. From 1952 to 1955, the great naval yards hummed like operating rooms as 13. Essex-class carriers underwent what felt like radical surgery. Outwardly familiar silhouettes remained, but inside their skeletons were cut open and rebuilt decks extended over the side. Island stacks shifted, arresting gear and support systems gutted and modernized. Steam catapults and mirror landing aids installed, wiring rerouted, hangars reconfigured. It was a massive, months-long effort in dry dock that transformed each ship's tempo and temperament. Crews relearned how to fight and fly from them. The result? Ships that looked the same from afar but behaved like brand-new jet-ready warships, the first already proving the idea by late 1952. December 1952, the USS Antietam eased out of the yard carrying something small and revolutionary, an angled flight deck. She was the world's first operational carrier with that new geometry. There was no time for more trials. Korea was burning, and doctrine had to prove itself in real combat. Pilots and deck crews traded cautious optimism for raw focus as jets cycled on a deck built to a new logic. Every bolter, every arrested landing would be a test, and every sortie a verdict. Antietam sailed straight into war, her first mission set to decide whether this simple angle could reshape carrier warfare. The results from the war zone were decisive. Antietam's angled deck didn't just work, it transformed operations. Compared to her straight-deck sisters, she generated 74% more sorties, turning slower, vulnerable cycles into a pulse of continuous strikes. Turnaround times collapsed, launches and recoveries overlapped, and the carrier could press the fight harder and longer than anyone had expected. What had been a crippling bottleneck became a force multiplier. One ship now hurled sorties with the tempo of an entire task group. And this wasn't just a headline number for the men who flew and fought from her deck. The change would be life-altering. For pilots, the change was life-altering. On a straight deck, coming home felt like a coin-toss, deck ready or deck closed. 50-50, so many guys planned for the ocean instead of the ramp. Antietam flipped those odds. Deck availability shot up to a reliable 79%, which meant fewer fuel dumps, fewer forced ditchings, and fewer missions ended by a waiting deck. Squadrons flew harder, commanders planned bolder strikes, and a pilot's return stopped being a prayer and became a bet you could win. It wasn't abstract, it was visceral. Lieutenant James Miker would see the difference with his own eyes. Lieutenant James Miker saw it firsthand. A battle-damaged fighter came in low, smoke trailing, and then the worst. It missed the wires. For a frozen second, the carrier held its breath, what on a straight deck would have been a catastrophic plunge into parked planes. Miker's heart sank. Sailors around him braced for the flash of fire. He watched the pilot wrestle the controls, the engine screaming, and the aircraft slide past the arresters as if fate had been sealed. Then, in a moment that felt impossibly small and enormous at once, the pilot slammed the throttle. What followed would change everything. Instead of a crash, the pilot simply powered up and went around alive, his damaged jet roaring down a clear lane and climbing back into the sky. Miker watched, still half convinced he'd misread it, as one battered fighter missed the wires and found nothing but open steel ahead. Then he watched it happen twice more that day. 3 bolters, 3 aircrews saved, 3 aircraft spared from what would once have been certain disaster. It was a small, almost quiet revolution on a carrier deck, but that 8-degree line changed the math of survival, turning catastrophes into recoveries and giving pilots a margin of life they'd never had before. By March 1953, the evidence was undeniable. Captain John Cromlin sent an urgent report straight to the top. Antietam's angled deck had boosted striking power by at least 85%, Pilots who would once have been lost now came home. Sorties that used to sputter and stall were flowing non-stop. Cromlin didn't hedge. He recommended immediate conversion of every carrier in the fleet, not later, not when convenient, but now. The tone was firm because lives and strategy hung in the balance. This was no incremental upgrade. It was a force multiplier, and the Navy finally had to decide whether to embrace it or be left behind. The revolution was real. This wasn't a tweak or a clever workaround. It was a rethink of the whole ship. Rather than shoehorning an angled strip onto an old hull, designers could build around the angle from the keel up, move the island, extend the waist, place catapults for simultaneous launches, and arrange hangars so maintenance never stops flight operations. Suddenly, a carrier was a true floating airbase, optimized for continuous, high-tempo power projection. In short, the supercarrier was born a new template for decades of naval dominance, and the first ship to try it would soon take shape. The USS Forrestal was born no retrofit, no patchwork. Her 8-degree angled deck was part of her bones, not an afterthought. Engineers folded that slight slant into the hull itself and shoved the island way to starboard, rearranging the ship so flight operations sat at the center of gravity. The effect was immediate. A clear landing lane, real estate for simultaneous launches, and a deck that behaved like a runway built into a battleship. It was the first carrier designed around continuous air power, a machine made to sustain strikes, not just survive them. Everything that came next, the catapults, the mirror landing, grew out of that single geometric decision. They fitted her with 4 massive catapults, 2 forward, 2 on the angled waist. Short, brutal lines of steam and steel that could hurl a loaded jet into the air while another was coming home. Launch and recovery no longer had to take turns. Deck crews could rearm and refuel in one pocket, while sorties were sent up from another. Suddenly, the carrier stopped being a bottleneck and started behaving like a conveyor belt of power. Sortie rates climbed, risks dropped, and commanders could keep pressure on an enemy without pausing. The Forrestal didn't just join the fleet, she multiplied its reach. The proof came fast and loud in shakedown trials. With its 4 giant catapults and new angled deck, Forrestal didn't just do one thing at a time, she did 3. She could catapult a strike group into the sky, catch a returning defensive patrol on the angled landing, and have deck crews rearm another flight all at once. Launch, recover, rearm, machines and men moving in tight choreography instead of waiting in line. That simultaneity turned what used to be a brutal bottleneck into continuous motion, a leap from stop-start carrier ops to persistent, overlapping sorties that would change how navies thought about air power. They called it rolling thunder, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it described something new and terrifying. A carrier group that could keep the sky full around the clock. Launch, recover, rearm, repeat. Fighters on station all night. Strike packages dispatched at dawn. The fleet no longer had a quiet hour. It had a ceaseless air shield and a relentless offensive tempo that could pester enemy formations, blind them with patrols, and punish targets whenever intelligence demanded. It turned carriers from episodic power into a continuous, dependable punch, and in doing so, it rearranged naval strategy, tactics, and the very rhythm of war. It did something almost nobody expected. It fixed the maintenance nightmare. Imagine a forward deck that used to be a crowded, dangerous parking lot. Now it was a calm, organized park where crews could work on planes while launches and recoveries happened just yards away. Engines were checked, guns reloaded, fuel topped, damaged panels replaced without stopping the flight cycle. What had been a maddening bottleneck became a continuous rhythm. Maintenance stopped costing time and started buying sorties. That steady, reliable turnover kept more aircraft airborne for longer and turned tactical flexibility into strategic advantage. For Soviet naval planners, this was a strategic nightmare. One American carrier group, a self-contained floating air force, could sustain continuous strikes, recover and rearm on the move, and project power across oceans in ways whole World War II fleets never could. Instead of waiting for convoys or shore bases, commanders faced a platform that could launch dozens of sorties a day, replace lost planes rapidly, and hold air superiority for days on end. In practical terms, a single task force now did the work of 3, sometimes 4, wartime fleets, rewriting the rules of naval deterrence and forcing rivals to rethink entire naval strategies. By 1959, 4 Forrestal-class carriers were operational, and the global balance of naval power had been fundamentally and permanently shifted. Suddenly, a single American carrier group could project the strike weight of entire mid-century fleets, forcing Moscow to rethink its naval doctrine and every rival to reckon with a new kind of sea-based dominance. These hulking floating airfields weren't just bigger ships. They were a new calculus of war, faster, sustained, and relentless. The strategic map was redrawn, bases and alliances repositioned, and naval planners on both sides chased ways to blunt what had become an almost unstoppable center of gravity at sea. And that shift wouldn't be temporary. It set design priorities for decades. What makes this story almost poetic is not some flashy invention, but a stubborn line of geometry, that 8-degree tilt, the placement of catapults, the cleared landing corridor, simple, elegant, and shockingly durable. Through jet engines that were heavier and faster, through steam and then electromagnetic catapults, through new arresting systems and radar-guided approaches, that basic arrangement kept proving itself. Engineers rebuilt hulls and moved islands, sailors learned new procedures, technology leapt forward, and still the same angled solution kept coming back as the answer. For more than 70 years, it has been the spine of carrier design, a small, steady idea that outlived every fashion and upgrade. Look at the newest American carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford. On deck, you'll see cutting-edge systems, electromagnetic catapults that fling jets into the sky, and computerized arresting gear that stops them on a dime, but underneath the flash is an enduring, elegant truth. Its flight deck is a direct descendant of the one tested on the Midway in 1951. The same 8-degree idea, the same offset landing geometry that turned a fatal flaw into routine survivability. Technology has changed engines and controls, but that simple line from 1951 still defines how modern naval air power moves and survives. It sounds almost anticlimactic, but that's the point. No fancy gizmo, no miracle alloy, no software patch could beat what an angled deck did because it attacked the problem at its root: physics and geometry. By giving jets a clear, off-center corridor to miss, power up, and fly again, the design erased the carrier's single fatal vulnerability and turned catastrophic failures into routine go-arounds. Solve the geometry, and you change the rules of the whole machine. Everything else catapults. Arresting gear, mirrors, becomes icing on a cake that's already solid. The real test wouldn't be drawings or debates, but what happened when these ships went back to sea. During Operation Inherent Resolve, the USS Dwight D. Eisenhower averaged 75 sorties a day for 7 straight months, an almost industrial tempo that would have been unthinkable in World War II. That relentless output depended on more than brave pilots. It relied on an angled deck and systems that let launches, recoveries, and maintenance happen at once. Powerful catapults and arresting gear that worked, and crews who could turn jets around fast. When aircraft streamed off and back again with no long gaps, commanders kept constant pressure on targets, and pilots could fly confident their carrier would be ready when they returned. Today, every Navy that runs catapult-assisted carriers uses the angled deck. It's become a universal, undisputed design principle. After Antietam and Forrestal proved the idea in trials and combat, that geometry stopped being an experiment and became doctrine. An 8-degree lane that lets jets land, miss the wires, and simply power up and go again. That turns chaotic deck cycles into steady, continuous sorties. That multiplied striking power and turned carrier groups into the relentless, persistent punch of modern navies. From Korea to the Gulf, from Cold War standoffs to today's missions, that simple angled line reshaped strategy, shipbuilding, and what a carrier can do. It was an idea born of British necessity, perfected by American ingenuity, and proven decisively in combat. Born on cramped, pitching decks where every inch mattered, it started as a painted line and a stubborn refusal to accept pilots as expendable. British sailors and a civilian physicist nudged a simple geometric rethink. American test pilots and engineers then stretched that line into an angle, rebuilt hulls, and risked careers to validate a counterintuitive truth. A small change in geometry could turn catastrophe into routine. In Korea and on the high seas, that modest shift transformed carriers from vulnerable islands into relentless, reliable airbases. Battlefield proof of a tiny idea with enormous consequences. You'd think the carrier's revolution came from bigger guns or faster planes. You'd picture stronger steel or new engines turning the tide. But the truth is quieter and almost cruelly simple. The transformation came from geometry and courage, a willingness to redraw a ship's traffic pattern and trust pilots to fly a new way. That small change multiplied sortie rates, saved pilots, and turned carriers from fragile islands into relentless, continuous power plants. It reshaped strategy, budgets, and lives. It proved that sometimes the most decisive innovations are not raw power, but a smarter layout. A single line, nothing more, was about to make history. It was a line, painted on a deck at an 8-degree angle. Not steel or rocket fuel, not a new engine or bigger gun, just geometry. That tiny tilt turned a floating parking lot into a moving, breathing airfield, turned catastrophic crashes into routine go-arounds, doubled sortie rates, saved pilots and planes, and forced entire navies to rethink power projection. In one bold stroke, the carrier stopped being a fragile, stop-start platform and became a relentless, around-the-clock machine of war. The smartest innovations are often quiet. They don't scream. They change the way you see the space you already have. Simple. A small line, tilted 8 degrees, became a life-saving idea. It turned a fragile, chaotic deck into a machine for continuous action, rescuing pilots who otherwise would have plunged into fire and sea, and converting carriers into relentless strike platforms that could press the fight day after day. That tiny geometric tweak forced shipbuilders to rethink hulls, islands, and catapults, birthed the supercarrier, reshaped naval strategy, and shifted the global balance of power. More than a technical fix, it was a new way of seeing a problem, and because it worked, it has governed carrier design and warfare for a century. It leaves you with a question, not about bigger engines or stronger steel, but about how we see the space we already occupy. A single angled line, 8 degrees, untangled traffic, saved lives, and remade naval strategy, all without exotic technology. If that simple shift could turn carriers into around-the-clock strike platforms, what other revolutions are hiding in plain sight? How many problems we throw money at could be solved by changing the geometry of our thinking instead of the tools in our hands? That's the challenge this story hands you. Look again, and look differently. It leaves you with a question. How often are our greatest breakthroughs not buried in some gleaming, complicated new gadget, but waiting for us in a simpler way of seeing the space we already have? Think about it. A painted line, an 8-degree tilt, a pilot given room to throttle up instead of crashing. Small, almost embarrassingly modest changes that flip a deadly weakness into a superpower. We chase bigger, faster, newer, and sometimes the answer is just a different angle, a tiny shift in geometry or mindset that suddenly makes everything work. Maybe the real genius is the courage to look sideways, not forward. It wasn't a new engine or thicker armor that remade naval power. It was a single line, tilted 8 degrees. A small act of reseeing turned carriers from vulnerable parking lots into continuous flying machines. Pilots stopped gambling with their lives. Fleets regained tempo. Strategy changed. And the lesson travels far beyond ships. The biggest leaps often hide in tiny shifts of perspective, in rearranging what we already have instead of chasing something brand new. So ask yourself, when you're stuck on a problem, are you hunting for a fancier tool or simply looking with fresh eyes at the space you already own?